Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Energy Connects podcast. I'm your host, Chiranjib Sengupta. The energy sector plays a major role in deciding the future of the world in the 21st century. And as one of the strongest voices today in developing new energy resources and in the energy transition, India offers unprecedented possibilities for the energy sector in the 21st century. Now, this was evident earlier this month when thousands of global energy leaders, energy company CEOs, and experts gathered in the South Indian city of Bengaluru, where the Honorable Indian Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi opened the inaugural India Energy Week. Held under the theme of growth, collaboration, transition, India Energy Week was the first major event of G20 under India's presidency in 2023. It convened more than 40,000 energy professionals, 500 international speakers, and 8,000 international delegates from over 100 countries. Now, as India works on its roadmap to secure its energy needs in a reliable, affordable, and sustainable manner, India Energy Week offered a fantastic platform for energy sector leaders, stakeholders, and policymakers to exchange ideas. To talk more about India's quest for energy security, its role in the global energy arena, and in securing a sustainable future for humanity, I am joined by our guest for today, Vandana Hari, the founder of Vanda Insights, the Singapore based provider of intelligence on global energy markets. Vandana has 25 years of experience in providing intelligence on the global oil and gas markets to executives in the industry and related services, government officials and agencies, as well as wealth managers. Before launching Vanda Insights in 2016, Vandana served as Asia Editorial Director at S&P Global Platts, overseeing the regional commodities section, news and pricing operations, and leading the company's business strategy. Many thanks for being with us here today, Vandana, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to talk to you, Chiranjeev.
So, how was your initial impression of the inaugural India Energy Week? It was so crowded, and there were thousands of people there every day, and I would say it was one of the busiest energy shows ever to be on its inaugural edition.
Yeah, so it was quite spectacular, wasn't it? Foremost, for me, the event represented India coming into its own as a major economic power and a consumer that is mapping the way forward to meet the fast growing energy needs of its 1.4 billion people, the largest population in the world now. And of course, it was much more than symbolic. It offered a platform for the Indian government and the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas to get its voice across to the world on its roadmap and its aspirations for balancing energy affordability and accessibility with environmental targets. So as we know, India has targeted net zero by 2070. I thought with a strong presence of industry leaders and thought leaders from around the world, it provided for a cross-pollination of ideas and a meeting of the minds. All the key topics were on the table and discussed openly in an environment of mutual understanding. We had, of course, energy security, the role of fossil fuels, ensuring a just and stable transition to cleaner fuels, the alternatives available in that area, and the enabling technologies, which were showcased in the exhibition halls. The world of energy is highly interconnected globally. So I think this kind of dialogue is crucial on a regular basis to ensure that countries and multilateral organizations have a clear understanding of their position in the ecosystem, and they work in collaboration, not at cross purposes. India is being increasingly looked upon as a potential leader for emerging economies of the so-called global south in charting a course for a stable and sustainable energy transition. I think this event framed India as a strong contender for that role.
Right. I think collaboration was one of the key words there. And some of the inaugurations or the announcements that we saw from the show. For example, the Prime Minister announced the 20% ethanol blend, and also inaugurated a solar cooker system developed by Indian Oil. What would your reactions be to those kind of initiatives?
So these are good initiatives, and I particularly like the idea of the hybrid solar cooker, which can be used indoors and seamlessly, even when the sun is not shining. Energy diversification needs to be an ongoing process. And I think encouraging inventions such as the solar cooker is key to keeping that momentum of technological innovation going. Now, for India, of course, energy diversification offers a degree of energy security, as well as a way to reduce its dependence on fossil fuel imports, even if that is happening more at the margins right now. As far as biofuels are concerned, I think what I like about India's biofuel strategy is that it is based on the so-called G2 or second generation feedstock, which is essentially your agricultural waste. And that takes care of the food for fuel conflict, which sort of hampered efforts of the first generation biofuels. Now, as we know, India is an agrarian economy. 70% of rural households depend primarily on agriculture for livelihood. So if we can give farmers an additional source of income from their waste, essentially, while also reducing the country's fossil fuel dependence, I think it's two birds with one stone.
Absolutely. Around the same time last year, there was an environment of heightened uncertainty and volatility around the energy markets with the start of the Ukraine conflict. And since then, the question that's been asked frequently is that, are countries and companies going to prioritize energy security over, let's say, the transition to renewables? And in the context of India, what would be your view?
So, indeed, I think last year's energy crisis, and primarily driven by the Ukraine invasion, changed quite a lot of thinking around the energy security aspect of transition. Look, I don't see it as sort of one aspect versus another or trumping another. I feel sustainability has to go hand in hand with supply security, affordability, accessibility. And that's true of all natural resources, not just energy. I think what last year's energy crisis did, especially in Europe and the Western world, and call it a silver lining, even if you wish, was to restore some perspective to the objective of energy transition. I do see now a more level-headed thinking starting to emerge, as against the sort of rash and bulldozing arguments for eliminating all fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Killing oil and gas before viable alternatives are available is a recipe for disaster. It's not the silver bullet for decarbonization. You cannot sacrifice economic growth. In fact, economies in trouble will regress to the cheapest fuels, which also happen to be the dirtiest. Look at how coal use surged in 2022 across the world, not just in Asia, but also in Europe. What is good about India is that it has always taken a pragmatic approach to the energy trilemma or quadrilemma, as some have begun to call it now. I see the country starting to hone its strategy further, and equally importantly, finding a voice on the global stage. Because these are complex, sensitive, and even divisive issues. So a not so popular viewpoint needs to be articulated cleverly, clearly, and diplomatically. I think India is ready for it, and events like India Energy Week prove that.
Right. And some of the demand supply side has also been redrawn. Like, for example, a lot of Russian crude is now being absorbed in India. So, how do you think that has kind of had an impact on the global energy markets?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that point because I feel India has unfairly come in for criticism for absorbing more Russian crude, which is ironically exactly what the West wanted. It wanted to shun, so not import itself Russian oil, but allow that oil to continue flowing into the global markets, and that is wise, and that is critical, because we can't afford any more shortages and price spikes in oil. So we reckon India is now taking about 1.4 million barrels per day of Russian crude, going by January data, which is nearly 30% of its import requirements. Now, of course, contrast that with zero until the start of last year before the Ukraine war. So the country has jumped in to sort of fill that gap. If the EU is not taking Russian oil, who will take it? Not just that, but it's ramped up very, very quickly. I find it a bit odd, frankly, that the country has had to defend its decisions and its moves. Had India and China not stepped in to buy incremental crude, which was being rejected by the West, we would have had a massive hole in global supply and much higher prices than what we are seeing today.
Right. And in the long run, let's say, how do you see this playing out? What does it mean for balancing the markets?
So as of now, the base case assumption in the energy markets is that, unfortunately, the Ukraine war is not coming to an end anytime soon. I know in recent days, the prospect of peace negotiations has popped up again. I sincerely wish that leads us to a peaceful resolution. But as far as the markets are concerned, the base case scenario is that things remain in a state of conflict, which means a couple of things. First of all, the massive, unprecedented redrawing, rewiring of global trade in oil as well as gas, in the form of LNG, that has started last year, is going to continue, is going to consolidate this year. So to some extent, it's just learning to live with the new normal, if you will, in that case. Of course, it's been a process of considerable upheaval. So far from what we have seen, the crude imports that have been banned or seized by European Union have managed to find homes in China and India primarily. Now, as we know, starting February 5th, the European Union stopped importing seaborne, or essentially all of Russian refined product imports. And that's going to be a slightly different ball game, because India and China, which were very natural, ready sinks for Russian crude, are certainly not the same kind of sinks for Russian refined products. So Russian refined product will have to now travel longer distances to find new homes in farther away places. Could be countries in Africa, Latin America. There are concerns over not enough tanker capacity available. It's a much more fragmented market. So by no means has this upheaval ended. The other aspect of this is that Europe is now living with far less of Russian gas than what it has received for the past several years and decades even. And so there's another rewiring going on there, which is Europe is importing more and more of LNG. Now, they do not believe in signing long-term LNG contracts like Asian economies do. So they are looking for more spot, short-term LNG, and which creates a sort of different kind of problems, because even though Asia buys the bulk of its LNG requirements on a term basis, it does buy a lot of spot LNG as well. And if Europe with its greater paying power, is going to continue pulling away that LNG from the market, then that means any incremental LNG that the more price sensitive Asian countries want to buy is going to be difficult for them. So, that takes us back to what I mentioned earlier about countries then having to fall back more on coal for power generation, for instance. So how long these changes, this reshuffling will last is actually anybody's guess. But markets are more in a one day at a time kind of mode. And as of now, they're just assuming that this reshuffle and this turbulence will continue at least through the rest of this year.
Right. And do you think, like, for example, last year, there was a lot of speculation and anxiety as Europe approached winter. However, I think more or less things went smoothly, and there was not really the kind of crisis that many people were anticipating. What's your take on that? And because there were so many different and often conflicting outlook on that, and how's this winter looking according to you?
Yeah, so it could be a short-lived relief. So first of all, in terms of breathing room, undoubtedly that has happened. It was a much milder winter. I was going to say wilder, certainly not a wild, but a mild winter. And which was, of course, came as an absolute blessing for Europe, because its energy consumption, its gas consumption essentially was much less than what a normal winter or a harsher winter would have seen. And the prices have dropped. Gas prices have dropped, power prices have come off, welcome relief across Europe as a result of that. And as a sort of trickle-down effect of that, Europe is entering the summer months, which are equally important for the region to rebuild its gas inventories in preparation for the next winter. It's entering the summer months very, very comfortable on its gas stocks. So one could then assume that the summer is not going to be very difficult for Europe to rebuild levels to where it needs them to be, come 23-24 winter. But, the crux of this whole problem, the turbulence in the markets remains. So one is, of course, the shorter term effect, which was the Ukraine war. But a longer term effect also is that there's simply not enough investment happening in the upstream. And in terms of in gas, it's not just, producing prospecting and producing gas, but also putting up mega billion-dollar liquefaction plants to convert it to LNG to be shipped across the world. So, these are sort of bottlenecks which are worsening over the past several years. And it would have been all right. The world would have still managed had things not transpired the way they did with the Russian reshuffle of flows. But when spare capacity is limited, when investment is limited, on top of that, if you have a major upset like the sanctions and the reshuffling of Russian flows, it is actually a recipe for more energy crisis ahead, unfortunately.
Right. And I think we'll journey back all the way to India in light of that very comprehensive forecast, and talk a little bit about one of the things that might help in that journey is the diversification of energy. And India, as you know, just before the show, before India Energy Week, India announced a very, very ambitious green hydrogen policy and lots of milestones there. In renewables, also, India was one of the first countries to set up the International Solar Alliance way back in, I think, 2014. So what would your take be on all the efforts that India is making in that regard?
So as far as green hydrogen is concerned, first of all, let us just acknowledge that hydrogen is the talk of the town, especially amongst policymakers and industry stakeholders. who are very, very keenly focused on trying to move their countries, their companies, and just generally consumers away from fossil fuels into newer, greener forms of energy. Having said that, hydrogen, I think we need to acknowledge as well, is a relatively nascent technology in terms of you have all the colors of hydrogen. It doesn't help. It confuses a lot of people. But underlying that is basically, I think, the intent to ensure that we do not pursue a potential new source simply because it is a new source and, tagging green to the word hydrogen. And, it just seems and feels cleaner and better than the, crude and natural gas and so on. Green hydrogen essentially is hydrogen, at least the way India is looking at producing green hydrogen is through electrolysis of water. Now, when we look at that mode, obviously we have to pay attention to how clean is the power, the electricity that will be used for the electrolysis, right? Now, that unfortunately leads you into slightly murky waters, because in India, well, of course, the country has been growing quite at a phenomenal rate. Its renewable power generation capacity. The fact remains that the lion's share of India's power generation comes from coal. So while coal's installed capacity is about 50% of the country's total, the actual power generation, obviously, because it's the cheapest form of electricity, the actual power generation is nearly 3/4 of Indian power generation that comes from coal. And wind and solar account for about 1/4 of the country's installed capacity, going by the latest data, official data, but account for just about 10% of the total power generation. So to my mind, it's good. It's good to examine all these options, but then for green hydrogen, you will have to, and especially if you want to scale it up, you would need to then essentially ramp up your clean power generation, which has its own issues aside from affordability, of course. So clean power, the renewable power costs have dropped substantially over the past several years. But then again, when a country is fighting inflation, when it needs all the energy resources it can get its hands on, coal offers the cheapest source of power generation, and there's just no running away from it.
Absolutely. And in terms of renewables as well, do you think that India is in the right direction, if not already with the projects that are underway?
Yeah, so I think it's a no-brainer for India, a country with, I'm not much of an expert on solar and wind power generation, but from what I can tell, a country with plenty of sunshine, so solar power definitely holds a lot of potential for India. Wind power, perhaps, to a smaller extent. I think one of the challenges for the country with regard to solar power, and I know that there is now thinking around how to overcome that problem as well, is India's over-dependence, very heavy reliance on China for solar panels. So, the country is wanting to step up its indigenous manufacturing capability. I know it is attracting, it's inviting a lot of investment into that area as well. And, so as a result, that is definitely the way to go. But I think it would be sort of misleading to assume that renewable power can very quickly displace coal in India. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, this year the country might use even more coal than last year. Ensuring that there is power generation available, especially manufacturing. India wants to attract more investment into manufacturing. That depends on reliable supply of electricity as well. So these are quite complex, interconnected webs which is why I say that one has to take a very careful, cautious, and pragmatic approach to transitioning to newer fuels, greener fuels, which I think then the country is overall on the right path on that.
Right. In your view, what are the emergent technologies that are helping transform the energy industry?
So again, I'm very as a believer essentially in the need for continued investment in oil and gas, or the traditional fossil fuels, even if not coal. Definitely oil and gas need to be invested in. It is obviously equally important to try and decarbonize oil and gas. Now, of course, there is considerable debate around scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and which one should, what sequence it should come in, or who should do what. And we'll not go down that route. Maybe leave it for another day. But I think just talking about the upstream, and because this is where the oil and gas industry, with let's say deep pockets, a very close relationship historically with technology and being at the forefront of technology, I think can play a very important role. So that goes to essentially scope 1 emissions, which is reducing emissions, flaring, methane flaring, especially in oil and gas production. So I think carbon capture, utilization and storage, or carbon capture and storage, to my mind, is one technology that needs probably much more investment, attention, and just general policy support than what it is getting right now across the world. So India is not a major producer of oil and gas, but it is a modest producer. So I think definitely this is one technology that India should look at encouraging. It's not a very cheap technology at the moment. It's not one that all oil and gas producers can afford. So perhaps it needs some sort of a policy support and incentives. Now, another reason I like CCUS is that the technology, or essentially the concept or the principle, is the same that can be deployed in other energy intensive industries as well. And perhaps equally importantly for India, in the coal sector as well. So abating emissions that happen at the coal power plant. So that is one. And, I think wind and solar power, and again, the technologies that have enabled the costs to go down rapidly in recent years, I think India is doing quite well already on that front.
Right. And finally, let's talk a little bit about the challenges ahead for the industry. I think in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of changes in direction, like we spoke about earlier in the conversation. So according to you, what are the key challenges that will shape this whole pathway to the energy transition and to net zero?
You mentioned the word transition. So I think above everything else, a level-headed, pragmatic approach to energy transition, which keeps energy security firmly in sight. I think that is the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity to get things right for the energy sector. Now, feeling passionately about a cleaner environment and sustainable use of natural resources is good, without doubt. Wanting to accelerate that process is also understandable, but big decisions should be taken with a careful assessment of how the world's current energy needs are being met, how we will replace fossil fuels with cleaner alternatives, BTU for BTU. So, we have to do our calculations right over there. So, and this replacement, one is not talking about just in the lab or in pilot projects, but commercially, on scale, and affordably. We cannot make rash decisions based on simplistic or reductive thinking. Energy supply is just too fundamental to our existence and our way of life and our economic growth to be trifled with. And that takes me to the point of investment. I think just not enough investment is happening in the upstream sector, in producing oil and gas, as well as the downstream refining sector, actually. So, both of these are potential flashpoints for the future. We need to find a way to turn this tide, or be resigned to live with the consequences, which will be just more energy commodity crisis and more super cycles. If we don't want that, we need to stop, re-examine, and change course right now.
Right. Vandana, this was such a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for your great insights and for joining us today on the Energy Connects podcast. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And a big thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And we hope that you enjoyed this episode. You can check out more podcasts, videos, and comprehensive content on the energy industry at energyconnects.com. I'll be back with more guests from the industry in the next episode of the Energy Connects podcast. Until then, thank you and goodbye.